Hello everyone and welcome to the next video in the vocal analysis series. We are going to be talking about Ibara today, and I won't make any predictions on how long or short this video might be, but there are a few things I wanted to talk about, so hopefully I remember all of those as we go through this. In terms of a vocal comparison, Ryochin has had roles in a lot of pretty well-known series, but not really roles that would allow him to sing a lot. But when in doubt, we can always trust in the Sword Boys. So here's a little bit of his singing as Shishio from Tokenranbu, and I think you will find it sounds quite different from Ibara, so I thought it was an interesting comparison. So yeah, listening to that, they really don't sound like the same person at all. There are a couple of little vocal things that are similar, but tonally and even in just the style that he's singing, because they are much different characters, there's not much that you could say sounds the same, but I think it does show his range, and that he's comfortable maintaining these character voices even while singing, which actually will fit a bit more into what I want to talk about with Ibara than it might seem like right now. Also, for the record, Shishio's very cute. You can't really see it in the picture, but he has this, I guess technically it's called a Nue. It's a yokai. It's this really furry creature that he just kind of carries around with him all the time. Look, at some point I'm going to convince someone else to get into Tokenranbu because of these videos. But just know, as always, I love Sword Boys a lot, and you will keep hearing about them because of the incredible amount of voice actor crossover there is between these two series. But moving on to what we are actually here for, let's talk about Ibara. Now, going into this, I feel like the idea I had of Ibara's voice is that it would be extremely militaristic, because that's the impression that he tends to give off. But actually listening to his singing, it's a lot less than I thought it would be. In that I think the most militaristic aspect of his singing really has more to do with his tone than anything else, because his general pitch and his style of singing overall is actually rather fluid. And especially in comparison to a few of the other characters we've talked about in this series. Characters like Himeru, like Tatsumi, like early Adonis. These characters that were very, very much singing in a rigid and precise and very contained way, especially at the beginning. Ibara has never really had that, and I feel like people associate that idea with him much more than it actually exists, which is kind of interesting. And normally I wait until a little deeper into the video to go into my whole character analysis versus voice shtick, but this is actually something that's relevant all throughout the songs that we're going to listen to, so I figured I'd mention it now, so if you want to listen out for it, you have that knowledge going into it. But the interesting thing about Ibara, and I think this was reinforced even more from the latest event, where he just had the recent 5-star, so I don't want to go too much into it because of spoilers for people that haven't read the event yet, but this is kind of an overarching theme of his character, so I don't think it's super spoilery to talk about. But Ibara is one of those characters that wants to present himself a certain way and wants to give off a certain impression, and I think has been so successful at that sometimes the other characters, even the ones that are closest to him, forget that there's more to him than just that. And I feel like that's very reflected in his singing. Because knowing what kind of character he is and knowing what his speaking voice sounds like, you have this image in your head of what his singing voice should sound like, and I think you make yourself believe that it does sound like that, even though listening to it closely, it actually doesn't. So the idea of Ibara presenting this image of himself that other people tend to look at and say, you know, oh, it's Ibara, so it's okay if we do things this way, or that he only cares about certain things without taking the idea that he might have personal feelings into account, is actually really interesting when contrasted with his style of singing. And I'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into Eden as a group, which we'll do right away, but I wanted to kind of get this out there first because I think it's important to note overall when speaking about him as a character, but also speaking about the vocal progression that he goes through over the course of the series. And in looking at Eden as a group, I think Eden's another one of those groups that nobody really has any issues with in terms of mixing or vocal blending, but I feel like Ibara is kind of in this weird middle zone, because being half of Adam, he's kind of naturally associated with Nagisa, but his and Nagisa's voices really aren't that similar, other than the fact that they're both using quite deep tones, and I would say that Ryochin is probably lowering his larynx, especially when you compare it to some of the other character voices that he uses that are a lot higher and a lot more nasalized. Ibara's sounds a lot more open. So there's that kind of similarity, but one of the interesting things about Eden in general is that because Suobe's voice is naturally so deep, and because the Eve half of things has naturally higher voices and generally tends to sing notes that are a lot higher, they end up doing much more harmony than other groups, not really on purpose, but because they have to due to the voices that they're working with. And it's interesting because generally when you have harmony, normally you will have, whether it's higher or lower than the main melody, it's usually an extension of it in some way. Whereas with Eden, a lot of times it ends up being out of necessity rather than a deliberate choice, if that makes sense. There are a few examples, and you'll hear it as we go along, where Ibara is singing with either Hiyori or June, and they're both singing at the same pitch, and then he'll sing the exact same vocal line with Nagisa, and Nagisa will be doing a lower harmony. So it ends up being really interesting because a lot of times the exact same vocal line will sound different from, for example, one chorus to another because they have a different makeup of singers doing that line. And the one thing that I think tends to get overlooked when Ibara sings is that he is perfectly capable of hitting all of the notes that Hiyori and June can hit. It's just normally we don't think of him as a singer that can sing high because he's part of Adam. But in all of the songs where he is singing with Hiyori or June, they are always singing the same pitch. And he does the exact same things that they're doing in terms of falsetto and head voice and belting. So I think that's another one of the big things I noticed going through this is that vocally he's probably a lot more proficient than a lot of people realize just because of how Eden is split up and how they tend to be grouped together when they're singing. And again, I was debating how I should divide these songs. In the end, I decided to go with all of the full Eden ones first, then Adam, then everything else. So we'll talk more about Adam as a subunit when we get to those songs, but we'll take a look at all of the four-person Eden songs first. So let's get into it. So in these really early ones, they tended to just group Adam and Eve together in terms of duets. Like in this one, he only sings with Nagisa when they're not singing in unison. And you'll hear this with some of the early Adam songs too, is that at this point, they did kind of try to keep Ibara and Nagisa on the same pitch, except for at the very end there when he goes higher. But as time goes on, they start going more and more into the harmonies, and I think we've established by now that I really enjoy harmony in music, so I'm glad that they're kind of looking more into that. Even if in this case it has more to do with the vocal makeup than because they actually are wanting to intentionally do more harmony, but I feel like it's happening with more units as time goes on, so I'd like to believe they're expanding into it more. But at least for Eden, we'll be talking about that more later. And this one, even though he doesn't have a lot of lengthy solos, you can already hear what I was talking about in the beginning, where his voice is not nearly so structured as you might think it is. He's already going into vibrato, and he has a fairly textbook vibrato when he actually has notes that are long enough to show it off on. He's already crescendoing and decrescendoing throughout his lines. His vocal attack on notes is not nearly as sharp as you might think it should be. And a lot of Eden songs, just by virtue of the type of music they typically do, don't really give the singers a chance to kind of showcase a broad range of emotions, because a lot of the times it's got this very sultry EDM inspiration, and if you look at the lyrics to pretty much any one of their songs, like, they are not being subtle in any sort of way. So I think a lot of the impression of Ibara's voice comes with, the music that he's doing combined with his character traits, but it almost feels like that's at odds with what his voice sounds like a lot of the time. 君の意識どうせ忘れるからでみたいんだろう奪ってしまったんだね早く望んで身をよしれの限界試す裏切りに決心のあらわにカノンの奥へ身を委ねでみたいんだろう He doesn't get a lot of solo work in Dance in the Apocalypse, but he does get to sing with both Hiyori and June, and this is the first time you can see an example of what I was talking about at the beginning, where when he is singing with Nagisa, they are almost always doing harmony, and after this point, they almost always will be doing harmony. But when he is singing with either June or Hiyori, they're always singing at the same pitch. And it's not quite so evident in these early songs because, like with most units, it feels like they were trying to get a sense of how all of the different voices work together. But as time goes on, in Eden songs, he'll start singing with Nagisa less and singing with June more. And they kind of group, like if they're not singing in their subunits, then Ibara and June are always singing together and Hiyori and Nagisa are always singing together. Ibara and Hiyori don't actually get to sing together that often, and again, I don't think there's any particular reason for it because they sound fine together. But it's just something I've noticed when I was going through the vocal divisions in all these songs. And Ibara is another one of those characters, we've talked about some before, that have a voice that is deceptive in the sense that his tone and his pitch don't always seem to match. And I think that's another reason why the impression that he gives off is that he doesn't sing as high as he does. But especially when he is singing with Hiyori and June, you can tell that he's hitting these notes perfectly fine. He's still using that deeper tone, but the physical notes that he's hitting are actually quite high. And the effect that gives off is that you can actually hear their voices very distinctly in the mix, so it works out really well. But it's interesting in that it's not really the first thing you think about when you think about what Ibara's voice sounds like. Kiseki is an interesting song because, obviously it feels more like a Trickstar song because I think the intention of it is that it's supposed to be a Trickstar song, but because of the way the anime shook out, they decided to give Eden a version. So it doesn't really fit the typical style of music that they do, but there are still some aspects to it, like with the somewhat dissonant strings, some of the minor chords, that still feel like they fit Eden, but it's certainly not a straight-up Eden song, so it's kind of interesting to hear them singing in this. And I think this has the best example we've talked about so far of a section where he is singing the exact same notes with Nagisa and then later on with Hiyori, and he's singing harmony with Nagisa and he's singing equal to Hiyori. So I'll play both of those back to back just so you can hear it again. And like I said, this is something they do a lot, especially to keep Nagisa's voice lower than everyone else's. But I'm always a fan of it, so I kind of like that it's turned out this way, regardless of whether they went into it at the beginning expecting it to. Another thing I've noticed with Ibara's voice, and again, the songs we've listened to so far don't give him a lot of room to kind of expand on it, but he has this very, pulsing, almost hypnotic way of singing that, again, I think fits with his character really well because one of the things that Ibara is very good at is exerting influence and kind of the idea that he's good at making people do what he wants them to do. So it's really interesting to hear these facets of his voice that really play into that part of his character, while at the same time, he's still doing vibrato. He's still incorporating dynamics into his singing. So there's this really fascinating dynamic between what feels like very deliberate choices combined with an almost naturally emotive type of singing style that really feels like it shouldn't work for him. But I think when everything comes together, it does. And it's something that, in the mix singing with other people can get lost because you're not isolating his vocals. But when you're just listening to what he's doing personally, it's a lot more prevalent. Okay, so this is the first song that kind of has him rapping, which is something that he does a lot. Actually, he does it in one of the Adam songs that technically comes out before this in the timeline, but we'll be talking about a little bit later. And one of the comments I had going into this video was about how good is he as a rapper. Here's the thing, I am not an expert in rap in the sense that I know what sounds good to me, but I can't say whether, technically speaking, that's considered quote-unquote good rapping. And especially when it comes to Japanese rap, most of my experience is from Hypnosis Mic, where again, they're playing characters. The one thing that I will say with Ibara is that when he raps, it almost feels like he's trying to even lower his voice more than he already is when he's singing. And sometimes it feels like he can get a little bit behind the beat, and I think that's really just because when you're trying to sing in a voice that low, it's a lot harder to control airflow, and it's a lot harder to get sounds out quickly. And a lot of Eden songs are very fast and very rhythmic, so he has no issue staying on the beat. I think it's more just the style of the singing that he's doing. It's very hard to do it quickly, and a lot of these rapping parts, it's kind of necessary to do it quickly. So that's my general impression of his rapping. It's not that it's bad, it's that sometimes I think it's almost impossible for him to stay on top of the beat and maintain the character voice that he's using. So this is kind of the spot in the timeline where he starts singing with June a lot more, and you can see almost all of his duets in this one are with June, outside of a couple with Nagisa at the beginning. They're starting to let him do more vocally, and it's not that I don't think he could have done more vocally before, it's just that the songs didn't really allow for it, but he's going into belts, especially now when he is singing just with Nagisa, and he's taking that higher part, he's belting a lot of the time. There's that one little section with June where they both kind of go into a little bit of vocal acrobatics at the same time. And they're pretty steady in terms of hitting all of the individual pitches within that simultaneously. He also has a little bit of a vocal cry on the one note, so again, it's very anti the idea of what militaristic singing should sound like, because he's still incorporating all of these things that we would consider more or less the opposite of that. And he never really stops that. It's kind of been there from the beginning, and he keeps doing it, I would say, does it even more as time goes on. Again, I think almost exclusively singing with June in this one when he's doing duets. I would say the rapping in this one is better. It's not very long, but he's hitting the beats a little bit harder and staying more on top of them. And I don't know how much experience Ryochin had with rapping before coming into Ensemble Stars, but I think a lot of that, again, is probably just getting used to doing it. And the fact that Ibara doesn't do it so often that it would probably be natural to slip into it. But even in these couple of songs, you can hear there's an improvement, at least in the sense of timing. Again, he's going up into belting a couple of times. There's one that's kind of, I would say it's somewhere halfway between belting and head voice, but a lot of it in these Eden songs is done in duets, so it's much harder to isolate the vocals and kind of hear it very cleanly. But we have some songs coming up where it will be much easier to do that, so we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so this one he does pop up into head voice with his one duet with Nagisa. Again, when he's singing with Nagisa, much easier to hear it just because their voices are so far apart pitch-wise. We get a little bit more with rapping, although in this one a lot of the rapping, I would say it's less rapping and more just talking in rhythm, especially with the pre-chorus bits and the parts that he does with June. But even in this, you can hear when he goes across that vocal break to get into head voice, it's very clean. So Ibara is definitely one of those characters that could do a lot more vocally and is capable of a lot more vocally, but the style of Eden songs doesn't really allow him to do that very often. But the next one we're going to talk about will be a little bit of a change. So, Deep Eclipse, I don't know if it's my favorite song from On Stars, but it is really up there. It's very rare that the first time I hear a song, I have kind of an instant emotional connection to it, but I feel like that happened with Deep Eclipse, and it really has never gone away. And I don't know what it is about it. I think maybe it's just because it's the first time that Eden has had a song like this, which is not really a ballad by any means, but compared to the rest of their discography, kind of fills that role, if that makes sense. It allows all of them to show off a lot more of what they're capable of vocally, And once again, listening to Ibara in the song, there is a lot of emotion coming through. There are vocal cries again. There's a part with June where they go up simultaneously into... And I think for Ibara, I think because he is singing with a lowered larynx, whenever he's going up into these high notes, it never really gets the quality of a true falsetto. But I think with June it is. So it's really interesting to hear their voices doing it at the same time, because they're not exactly using the same vocal levels. But I feel like those little imperfections also add to the song and really work with the song as a whole. And his last little solo from the bridge, I think, really showcases how easy it is for him to kind of play around with his tone. There's a part of it where he pushes a little bit harder. There's like a really harsh edge to his voice, and then he immediately pulls back and decrescendos into something that sounds a lot softer. And again, I feel like that's something you just don't think about with Ibara's voice, but listening to it like this, I'm really kind of starting to appreciate all of the things that he is doing. Regardless, I could talk about Deep Eclipse for a very, very long time. I won't. But there is so much about it that I love, and that's just a little bit of why it's so high up in my favorites list. So Keep Out is an interesting song as a whole, but there's not a whole lot to talk about in terms of individual performances, because this is really the only Eden song where there aren't any duets at all. It's just solo lines and then parts where all four of them are singing together. And the solo lines aren't particularly long. But there is one thing that Ibara is doing here that he really hasn't done before, and what he's doing is in a lot of these solo lines, he's injecting a little bit more breath into his tone than he has up until this point. So you end up with this almost kind of whispery effect going on, which is a little bit different than we've spoken about singers that have aspirate tones before, and that's more of a natural aspect of their singing tone as opposed to something that's deliberately put on. And since this isn't something we've heard him do a lot, I think he's doing it deliberately, kind of to soften his tone a little bit, but it does create a different feel to his singing. And this isn't the only time he'll do it, but it's probably the example where it's the easiest to hear, just because there's nothing else other than his solo lines to use as an example for this song. There's nothing really new in Absolute Perfection that we haven't heard him do before. And I was thinking about this last night when I was re-listening to some of this while I was editing the first part of the commentary, but there are some times when he's singing, especially when he goes really low, that he sounds a lot like Mao, and I don't think I've ever really thought about it before, but there are times when they sound very, very similar, and I don't think they've ever sang together. So I'd be really interested to hear what that would sound like. But the one thing in here I do want to point out is there's one part where his voice crescendos along with the music, and I actually had to cut it for time in the song compilation, but I want to play just the middle section of it so you can hear the entire effect. And I always think it's really cool when they take something that the singer is doing vocally and accentuate it even more by having the backing music doing the same thing. So you kind of have this electronic crescendo at the same time that his voice is getting louder. So this technically is the first feature 5-star song that Ibara has gotten for Eden, which really should be obvious, but I always forget that Melting Rouge Soul is technically an Adam song, so it's not a full group feature. And I think in terms of the song highlighting the 5-star character, this one does a pretty good job. He gets to do a lot of really nice solo work. You can actually hear some decently long examples of some of the things we've talked a little bit about. You can hear a lot of vibrato. He gets to use a lot of different aspects to his tone because there's a lot of dynamic change within the music itself. It goes quieter in the bridge and he kind of goes down with it. There's more crescendoing along with the music. And there's definitely been songs where he has done belting before, but I think this is one of the more obvious examples. So yeah, I think overall a good showcase of his voice. I'm glad that this song released before I had everything done for this video, so I actually got to include it and talk about it a little bit. And that takes care of everything as far as Eden goes, so let's look at Atom by themselves next. So I didn't throw in as many duets into these songs just because we've heard a lot of him singing with Nagisa throughout the Eden songs, and because there's only 2 of them, there's just more solo lines for each of them, so I wanted to get as much Ibara in there as I could. Listening to this directly after listening to the most recent Eden songs, I would say that his singing has honestly gotten softer overall. There's a lot here. Even when the music cuts out a little bit, his tone is still a little bit harsher than it tends to be in more recent songs. And like I said, with Keep Out, some of that is because he's injecting a little more breath into his tone, but a lot of it also has to do with his enunciation on the words, and that in at least the very early songs, he was coming at everything a lot more directly. I'd spoken before about his attack on notes isn't quite as sharp as you feel like it might be based on his character. This is probably the most direct it gets. And then as time goes on, it definitely softens a bit, kind of regardless of what parts of the song he's singing. So actually listening to this directly after the most recent song is really making that contrast obvious and how his singing voice has kind of developed over the years. So I've seen some people talking about how within the Eden, Eve, Atom structure, Atom is kind of the part that has the least concrete identity, at least in the sense that Eden at this point is fairly well established as being very suggestive, very EDM influenced. The Eve side of it is kind of the poppier, more upbeat part of things, and then Atom is kind of left in this space where a lot of the times their music feels more interchangeable with Eden than Eve's ever does. And I kind of understand that, but I think the biggest difference with Atom music is that in general there tends to be more of a rock feel to their music. They're actually using like a full backing rock band as opposed to relying more on the electronic elements. And if anything, I would say that Atom music is darker than Eden music in general. And that's kind of hard to quantify, and it's mostly just the feeling and the way the music is mixed has a different vibe to it than Eden music does. And I feel like The Beast of the End illustrates this really well because Ibara actually has a little bit of a growl in his voice that he never has in Eden songs. So just like in Ruler's Truth, where I was talking about that it feels a little bit harsher than what he's doing now, this one I would say even more so because he's adding this extra element to his vocals that doesn't really ever get to show up anywhere else. Mostly because it really wouldn't fit with what Eden is doing, but it fits with what Atom's doing. So even though I think there's a little bit of overlap there, I still feel like Atom has its own identity as a unit, especially when you're comparing it directly to some of the Eden songs. This one out of all of them, I would say musically sounds the closest to an Eden song, but there's still something about it that makes it feel more Atom to me. I think it just kind of has this like chant going on in the background. It's got this really driving low bass beat that's happening. And the biggest thing in this one, obviously, and the thing that I think people wanted me to talk about is this. And that, I believe, is a D sharp. More specifically, a D sharp 5, which is a very high D sharp, especially for people with naturally deeper singing voices. And bear with me, this is going to get a little bit technical. I hope this makes sense. So what Ibara is doing here is something that we would probably call a falsetto belt. And just as a really quick refresher, when we talk about belting in music, we're talking about notes that are higher than a person's natural vocal break, but that they still push through to sing in chest voice instead of going up into head voice. However, there is a limit as to how far you can push your chest voice up into those higher notes, and generally it ends up being about 5 or 6 semitones beyond a person's vocal break. So for someone that is a natural tenor, normally their vocal break is somewhere around like an F4 or a G4. And again, everyone's a little bit different. This is just speaking in averages. And when we're talking about semitones, the easiest way to explain it is think about a piano keyboard and that you're playing every single note. So every single white key, every single black key. Each one of those spaces is what we call a semitone. Likewise, if you've seen a guitar fretboard and you play every single fret, every fret would be a semitone. So if, let's say, Ibara's natural vocal break is somewhere around F4, and this is a D sharp 5, that's about 10 semitones. So even for a professionally trained singer, it would be very hard to belt that note in chest voice. So basically what he's doing is he's going up into a head voice or up into a falsetto, but he's using a really sharp injection of breath to get as much power behind that note as he can. So it ends up being in the style of a belt, but because it's so high up, the tone of his voice sounds more like a falsetto. So in short, there is no way to make it sound pretty, but it's not supposed to sound pretty. It's just supposed to be high, and it's supposed to be sharp, and it's supposed to be really impactful. And in either case, it is not easy to do. So if you've ever thought that note was impressive, it is impressive. I hope that kind of explained why I always am hesitant to get into music theory in these videos because it can be a lot, but that's the basics of what he's doing in that note. And Melting Rouge Soul is a very interesting song regardless because it has a lot of the meter doesn't change and the tempo doesn't change, but the division of beats within the measures changes, which is why it sounds so drastically different between like the opening verse and then the chorus when it comes in. So yeah, really interesting song, really great vocal work, kind of the last of Adam and Eve that we've heard as subunits, but you never know. They could always pull them out again one day, and I hope they do. I do like that he gets to sing with everyone from Switch in this, even if they are very, very short sections. Ibara is one of those characters that, because of the fluidity in his voice, he ends up sounding really good with other characters that have very neutral voices. So like he and Samugi sound really good together. I've talked a little bit before about how the OnStars producers always seem to have issues mixing Sora with people. I think tonally Ibara's voice is deep enough that they sound fine, and he and Natsume have such drastically different voices that you can still hear both of them, but these snippets are so short it's almost impossible to tell how they would sound if it was a longer line of music, but still glad that he gets to sing with all of them, at least a little bit. However, he does not get to sing with all of Trickstar in here. His longest duet in this song is with Nagisa, which is not uncommon for these cross-unit songs. A lot of times they will sing with their own unit. I wish it didn't happen as often, but I'm kind of used to it after all of these videos. He gets to sing with Subaru, and I think I talked about it a little bit in Subaru's video. Subaru's voice is neutral enough that they sound fine, and again, Makoto has a very distinct voice, so you are able to hear both of them. Like I mentioned before, there are some times when Ibara really sounds like Mao, so I would be interested to hear what they would sound like singing a duet. But otherwise, the biggest thing with all of these other songs, even if he's not singing much, it's just nice to hear them singing with characters that aren't the ones they usually sing with. So having said all that, it will probably come as no surprise to anyone that he sounds good with Tomoya and he sounds good with Yuzuru. He sounds really good with Yuzuru. I'm glad they actually have a longer line of music. There's a little bit more rapping in this song, but it's a slower rap, so I feel like it's more suited to his voice and he can kind of get into the flow a little bit easier than some of the really fast rapping that has to happen in some of the Eden songs. And he doesn't really get to sing with Rina. They kind of have a little rap line together, but there is a song coming up that he gets to, so I don't feel like they're missing out. And he's sung with Subaru before. So compared to some of the characters we've talked about, Ibara actually gets to sing with most of the people he's in other songs with, which is at least nice to hear. This is one of the only songs where he actually is talking in it, so I kind of threw that in there again just to get that baseline of his speaking voice compared to his singing voice, or in this case, his rapping voice. And we talked a little bit about this one in the Himeru video, but because this song was written and produced by someone that does a lot of work for Hypnosis Mic, it sounds drastically different than any of the other rapping that has been in Ensemble Stars up until this point. It's very quick. I think Ibara is keeping up with it better here than he has in the past, but the flow, especially in a lot of the division battle songs that happen in Hypnosis Mic, it is very driving. So I think sometimes that can help vocalists stay on top of the beat just because the beat is always there. It's impossible not to hear it, I assume, even in recording. In terms of his rapping style in this one, it does sound a little bit different than some of the other songs, which I would put down to the style of the song in general. And also, like I said in the Himeru video, my impressions of this song will be based entirely upon who in Hypmic these characters sound the most like. And Ibara is like this mix of Jushi and Judo somehow. And not to get too much into Hypmic because that's not what this is about, but both of those characters have voice actors that are in OnStars, so it's kind of related. If you've heard Judo rap, he has a very distinct style. He does a lot of, at the end of lines, he will get louder and kind of go up into this crescendo, and that's sort of what Ibara is doing at the very end of this section. Jushi, on the other hand, just because of his character and the fact that his character is a VK singer, has a naturally very dramatic style of rapping. And we've talked about how Ibara can have this very pulsing, hypnotic style to his singing, and in this one, I would say he's transitioning that more into his rapping than he has in any of the previous Eden songs. So again, if you know nothing about Hypnosis Mic, this will probably mean nothing. If you do, hopefully that makes sense. So yeah, this whole crossover event just kind of happened. I think there's a lot of interesting things going on in this song. There's just not a whole lot of singing in general. But what's there is interesting because he gets to actually sing with Rine. And Rine is one of those characters that really does sing with an edge to his voice almost all the time. So you can hear, even when he's singing with Ibara, his voice is still kind of has more of that. Ibara also gets to sing with Mayoi here, which I am glad about, because Mayoi is another one of those characters that has a super distinct singing voice and can get very, very dramatic when he wants to. So when they're singing together, Ibara is actually the one kind of pulling back. You can hear Mayoi is still kind of doing a growling thing in some of the notes, but Ibara is almost more so supporting his voice, which is not something he's really gotten the opportunity to do a lot before. So once again, a lot of these voice actors are able to pull it back when they need to, and I think this is a good example of how, even if two characters have really strong voices, there are ways to make it work. And speaking of that, in the comments of the Nazuna video, I actually had someone give me a theoretical shuffle unit and ask me if I thought that it would work. And it was Hokuto, Ibara, Mayoi, Izumi, and Kohaku. And I had replied that I didn't see any inherent issues with it, and then realized that I could actually just put those 5 characters together in one of the anniversary songs. So here's that. And obviously this wouldn't be an exact replica of what would happen if it was a song specifically written for them, because these anniversary songs are meant to be sung by literally any character. They're all kind of pulling it back a little bit so that they will sound good with everyone, but it at least gives you a baseline of kind of what their voices sound like together. So yeah, that combination I think could be really interesting, but at least based on this, I think they would sound fine. I I really like that Ibara got a song like Poison Strategy for one of his solos because Eden never really gets to do anything remotely close to the genres of like jazz or swing or big band. So giving Ibara this I think makes sense because it does fit with the style of singing that he does. It allows him to get a little bit dramatic with it, but his voice, because of the way it ebbs and flows, actually fits into a jazz style really easily. He also, because he gets to sing longer solo lines, gets to play around with his tone a little bit more. There are some parts where he's belting the end of lines where he completely cuts out the vibrato, which isn't really something we've heard him do before. And then when he's going up into a bit of a softer note, kind of more into a head voice and less of a belt, he brings the vibrato out, so it's a lot more noticeable. So this song, I would say more than anything, first of all, gives us a look at what his voice would sound like in a completely different style of music compared to his unit songs, but also reinforces some of the techniques we've seen him use up until this point. I actually really like both of Ibara's solos because I think they show off different parts of his character and different parts of his voice. Even though, once again, Salute Desire follows the basic song structure that so many of these second solos do. They really didn't get very inventive with a lot of them in terms of how the song is put together. But it's a really good song, and once again, not really something we've ever heard from Eden. Just like with Deep Eclipse, I wouldn't exactly call it a ballad. It's a little bit too fast for that, but it still kind of has that feel that allows him to bring more emotion through his voice. He's bringing in more vocal cries than he usually does. There's a chance for him to really expand his voice through these lines because they're longer and they're a little bit slower and he can breathe a little more. And there's, between the music and the singing style, there's like this vulnerability there that really doesn't happen a lot with Ibara, both in his singing and just as a character. Like, obviously, it is a part of his character, but it's a part of his character that he tries really, really hard to keep hidden. So I'm glad that there's a song like this that allows him to express it more and to kind of show off more of what he can do vocally when he gets the chance to just sing for 3 or 4 minutes straight. I really have no complaints about either of Ibara's solos. I really like that they're both different from the normal music that we get to hear him sing. So yeah, when it comes to those two songs, I have nothing bad to say. And that brings us to the end. As always, I hope that was interesting. I think it was really nice just to take a look at Ibara's voice in isolation. Because, and this isn't really something I ever talked about during the video, even though I mentioned a couple of character things, but one of Ibara's canon traits is that he kind of always wants to push the others forward, particularly Nagisa, so that they get more focused than he does. And I think you can kind of see that in the way that some of these songs are structured, but at the same time, the things that Ibara is doing while he's supporting the others are pretty impressive in their own right, and I hope getting everything together like this has allowed that to be more obvious, because it certainly has for me, and I'm glad I was able to do this because I think I'll definitely be paying a lot more attention to his voice in the future. Alright, so up next, I said I was doing Kato. I am doing Kato, and that, aside from Mama, will cover all of the units, so I'll have looked at least one person from every unit in the game, or at least all of the units that have been around long enough that they have enough songs that doing a video for them is worth it. Like I said at the end of the Nazuna video, after that I want to go back to the big units just because they still have 4 members each that I haven't looked at. So we'll do someone else from Knights and someone else from Ryusei Tai. Knights, I'm thinking probably Izumi because a lot of people had asked for him. And I was waiting until the song with Hiro and June came out. That's out now, so I can talk about it. Ryusei Tai, I haven't gotten a lot of requests for the other characters in that unit, so if there is someone from there that you would particularly like to see, please let me know. And as always, please like, comment, do all of the things that the algorithm wants you to do, and I will see you next time.